During the pentagram rite, I saw something like a white, slightly shiny fruit. It was longer than a mango, not quite the shape of a papaya, but it was above the chair. With the first set of vibrations, I saw a faint yellow mist within the bowl. With the second, I felt the presence in the northeast. With the third, I felt a closing in of the darkness from the south and a pressing upon me from every direction. In the fourth, the shadows had white sparklies in them. With the fifth, there were these little yellow lines that had a purple halo around them. And there was a pattern outside of the shadows, like angled sets of lines coming together. During the final reading, I felt like something was trying to get through something outside to the north. There was, at times, a sense of my weight not being on the floor. And in the final scrying, I saw streaks of light. I don't know what type of pattern to describe it as, but it seemed structured. And there was an absorbing into the light of the mist. You know, the light was right there. And I felt warm and content. There was a gentle scouring of euphoria that loosened up my pain and stiffness. The red shower reminds me of how every so often throughout history there's been reports of what looked like blood raining down. And some of it has been captured in modern film and such. Above the edge of doom reminds us that life teaches us, and we want to be trusting. Wild cyclamen is a type of flower I'm not familiar with, but certainly things that are around when a person is deathly ill or injured or that sort of thing tend to be remembered in different ways than those that are around during peak events that are totally positive. Gift of sight reminds us that nature has a consciousness. And we might say that nature calls us to be conscious. Badhoka refers to a Mexican myth, I guess, that I'm unfamiliar with. because certainly back in the day, people would try to worship entities of this, that, and the other. And a lot of the people calling themselves heathen and pagan nowadays want to reinvent names of lost, what they call deities. The Snapcone Wilderness reminds us of what happens when we try to tame ourselves. One of the things during retreat is you don't stay out, when you have to leave the place of retreat to take care of a need. You don't stay out to, comb your hair. Now, if it's no delay whatsoever, I guess you can do that when you bathe or whatever. But you quickly return with no, further delay. But even the difficulties that people have combing their hair sometimes, in a way, is something that can be appreciated. Change gets us towards thinking about what is beyond change. A court of love reminds us that there is a sense of awareness that you and everybody else is just involved in what you're actually involved with in the moment, are the covenant. Black refers to the pool of opposites. Between hyssop and axe might be thought of in terms of the oak and the holly myths of the different times of year. There's a time for cutting down, and there's a time for, the growth. And of course, they cut down the mistletoe and all that, which is the analogy. Gold and malachite seems to be more like a Day of the Dead poem, isn't it? The light and dark forces, as some people are going to call them, are present. And there's a decision to make. And a lot of that decision depends on your approach to material wealth and sensuality. Ambience used to be an approach to things, rather than looking online for whatever ambience, and people compose ambiances of the shows or the movies that they liked, or maybe it's not what they like, but what they think they can market off to others. Like, I've even seen something for somebody who's known as a Quran reciter that composed music for Korn, which was really versions of their songs in a sort of soft parade of sound. The vow, well, there can be hidden terms, and you really got to watch out for contracts with companies, whether it's products or otherwise. Sign on to social media. The TikTok and the Instagram in particular are bad ones. Facebook's just on the line of what's tolerable. I haven't been on Facebook in some time because of very thorough bans. No terms of service violations. Twitter, not banned so extensively, but, current on a ban there. The frog and the golden ball is sort of combining some fables, because I don't think they're really addressed as myths, but fables. The prince one, the frog turns into a prince, and the Cinderella sort of thing. And Cinderella, I like the idea that it has this starlight, the moonlight, the sunlight. So there's some mystical themes connected therein. Those who came short does refer to giving all in it, but in a sort of senseless way, a senseless way that needs to be placated. Whole love reminds us that there are dangers in relationships, and a person needs to, consider if these things are worth the cost. And if we take it beyond the modern selfish or short-term way of looking at it, well, it depends, right? But for most people, yeah, they're worth the cost, I would think. This holy month reminds us to take the outer and inner signs in while you can in their special time of year. I think that this whole thing refers to astrology of some sort. But then again, astrological language doesn't have to mean the sort of thing where you actually believe that because of this planet in this position or this star in this position, then such and such. I mean, the year operates like it is, whether or not Leo is a fire sign or an earth sign, whether Scorpio is an air sign or a water sign, or what month those signs are in heliacal rising. Spring is spring, summer is summer. The blow reminds us that some people have a different approach to violence. And thinking of that reminds it, hey, don't push buttons. Some people's like, oh, we're, just a little bit of a scuffle and they'll be over with. It's like, no, some people go into that mode and it's not something to mess with. Tomorrow's envy of today reminds me of some teachings not to revile time. And this thing about ifs. It's like, if I had known back then, but you may not have. The hidden garden reminds us not to have self-pity. And if something's hidden, well, again, maybe that's the thing to relish instead of... The wedding reminds us that such things are the hopes of more than just one individual. The impossible, well, we can relate that to abilities that some things have that other things don't. And we need to live on our own terms. What will be is reminds us that prices will be paid. And what is true, both as a noun and a verb, well, that may remain hidden, but it remains what it is. Iron Palace reminds us that when we try to make something what it isn't, or deny what it is, in a way we've imprisoned it, or we've imprisoned our sense of it. True joy is something that can be crystallized, something that is centered around respect. The fetter reminds that people pretty much punish themselves. About the excesses are, perhaps you could say, violations that were. Sun Altiz reminds us that people need to know that they're not as unique as they think, and that there's a limit to every type of praise we can give. To say somebody has been without, well, that's to deny perhaps the virtuous context or other way of expressing value of when there is indulgence, or was. Everywhere is here is like the collective unconscious, right? Are maybe more personal, that your sense of the external, while that goes through the same vehicle that you're in, it gets internalized. The far side of your moon, well, now we know that the moon rotates. It's not just a thing that the Quran talks about or anything. They know that everywhere on the moon receives light and darkness. Well, I mean, there are caves, but you know what I mean. And what people relate to is something that may not be known to others. Deliverance reminds me of something I said June 3rd, 2011. And the following days and some other instances would prove that true. And the he in the poem is more like the she, but in a way, just like in the poem, both of us were exposed to something along the lines of a freeing from some sort of prison of perceptions and it was sort of a tower card moment, or period of time, you could call it, because I guess some stuff could be said for over some of the years that followed. Conjunction, well, look at this tree here. And one of the things for the Celt is the oak tree is more or less the tree of paradise, isn't it? Or maybe it's a yew. No, not really the yew tree, because that's more like death. But there comes a time when the tests have been exceeded, and you know what you're going to be afterwards. Nothing now astonishes. It refers to the male and the female. It refers to things about the sea and the sky and exertion and rest. I'd die for you kind of has the same sort of approach that Love, Hate, Love by Alice in Chains has. Grace Notes reminds us that when enough of the details are known, we end up having this awareness of something else that isn't there physically, but it's perceived in that way. And no, I don't know how to play any musical instrument in a way that you hear grace notes. Good night to the old gods. Well, if they're real beings, that kind of doesn't go away, but certain favor as far as what the humans turn to are certain names and forms of some of these entities, are when we refer to ultimate divinity. Again, that can change through time, but I am definitely not of the theory that gods and goddesses can be made or taken down from, their rank or that sort of thing. The sweet shop round the corner reminds us of the sacrifices that parents make. And how the noticing of children might be only when it's too late to do something about it. Double bass reminds us of how there's the combination of drugs and music, and how the artist may connect both of them, and how some of the best art that moves us is connected to insanity of both. Descent into hell is something that Protestants tend not to believe, I don't think. You know, the Catholic doctrine to, or maybe they do, I don't know. But it was said to have occurred on the biblical Sabbath. And so the Christians have changed it to the day after. Not because Paul or any of the early Christians said so, but, because, again, the Catholic Church. And this poem denies the typical doctrine that Jesus did rise with others. But there is, of course, the idea of the final rising. And most that believe in resurrection are going to say that there's going to be, the final rising is going to come later. Afterwards, on the way up the hill, there was, in the northwest, sort of a green trail of sparkly color above the tree line. The pardon reminds us of the games that people play with accountability when things are not in appropriate context. Point of no return has its equivalents these days in that Linkin Park song. What's the name of it? I Tried So Hard? No. Everything You Say to Me. People call it the Shut Up song, but you know what I mean. A shift of scene is missing what was, and how no matter what wonder or other sign of comfort, it doesn't return what was. Like when people talk about replacing a pet. I mean, this is not what this is about, but you replace a pet, and it's like, no, you're not replacing a pet. You're getting another pet, but you're not replacing it. Cock and pullet's feathers remind us that true love admits when the other is flawed. Dead hand reminds us that those who probably should be mourned most for are those who have never lived, as they say, or who won't live. Arrears of moonlight reminds me of what someone once said, and while I don't think they were so vocal in excuses, but they were certainly letting their feelings form the excuses of further behaviors. What did you say is a reminder of people prolonging conversation in order to stay in each other's company? Blur of murder is, of course, getting out of hand in this day and age. and how that doesn't really end things. Even if there's no prison or execution or trial or any of that other stuff, it still doesn't really end things. Now, it could end some things, but, well, that's what makes it murder, right? Is that, it's not right to get to that point. The gorge, well, we can think of some metaphor there, right? But it reminds us that when we have a longing, that longing can draw focuses of certain aspects of the environment. Ecstasy of chaos reminds us how we need spontaneity. Stolen jewel, well, the jewel was the relationship, and how the loss of the relationship hurt both individuals. The Jager is, well, I'm unfamiliar, but we do tend to see ourselves, our interactions that we are part of, in what we witness outside of ourselves. That doesn't really have anything to do with it. The snapped thread reminds us of how spouses and others will become accustomed to each other, and the ability to take breaks or circumstances that make there be breaks can seem, like a miracle that you got through it, right? The fortunate child reminds us of those stories of babies and storks and stuff, but when it's a hero or something, it's the stories like with an eagle or something like that, right? Well, the myths. Loving true, flying blind reminds us that, yeah, we are creatures, and like other creatures or animals, or whatever other term that we're going to refer to these incarnate beings with, that they are such that we should choose our relationships based on how the other person is going to be to us, who we can trust the most. The near eclipse is about something that I have not really captured too well with the camera around here, but as you approach total eclipse, one of the things that you find is, these little partial eclipses that you see in between the little tree branches and that sort of thing. And how cultures will believe that the sun was swallowed by a dragon and all that stuff. Dancing flame almost implies like there's evil spirits involved in, illicit acts, which, yeah, there are. And maybe they know. So one of the things about some of these things is that there's entities that could betray some of these secrets. Birth of angels could refer to some idea of that separate type of creation, or it could refer to how in English we might see these references to humans as angels, when we're all still innocent and all that. On giving reminds us that we all have to give something if we want something lasting. The peng that was a ka'un is a mythological reference of a bird and a fish that change into each other, but it's not just any bird and any fish. Like owls, well, not like Bohemian Grove, right? They're sort of obscured creatures as a rule, but, they're hunters. They don't want everything to see them all at once. They're not one of those sorts of things. And, you can hear them 1,000 times before you see them once. Well, unless you climb one of their trees. And in perspective, people say love is blind, and it's like, well, if you're actually in love, no, you notice all that stuff, and eventually you do. So either you're in love, or you just love the body or some other aspect of the experience of the whole thing, and then that just fades and you go away if, once you realize, and you realize enough to have to admit it. The Outer Rim is one of those pits of hell references, right? It's a reminder that drugs have their limit of what they're going to do for us. And even if you're going through something, pain-wise and all that sort of stuff, there's an end to what these things can have, and sometimes it's returns worse and worse overall and all that stuff. So I understand taking painkillers and stuff to survive, but beyond that, well, I understand a lot of stuff, but, I can definitely excuse myself and others what is needed to survive. The bowerbird is not as pessimistic as the theme to Married with Children, but it's definitely something that we need to think about, is that some things, they're nice to go together, but they're not necessarily going together. But then again, you could say they do go together. Love and marriage do go together in a different sense. Mist refers to a reality of jealousy. Some are going to pretend, and others are going to help things along because of their positive expression. The word, well, some people don't want to be the first to express things. And it's almost religious in its reference to the fact that some things, well, we have to hear them from others before we realize them in ourselves. Our self reminds us that things are figured out by difficulty. They're figured out by hopes that at least distract from difficulty. Sometimes it goes beyond distraction. Bites and kisses remind us that the nature around us has much of the same sense of cost and reward in working together. Now, you can think of how cats aren't mentioned here, but cats, there's a difference between their play bites and play scratches and when they're really trying to hurt or kill something. Sunface and Moonface is a return to innocence sort of thing, right? And one can live an innocent life and be fruitful and defend that fruit and get back to the basics of, well, that eternal being You got to preserve that. Freehold reminds us that some things, in a way, undo the past. But the past is still there. The necklace reminds us of starting anew. It reminds us of what must be gone through to maintain the union of which that is a sign. A bracelet reminds us of the sympathetic magic that can be done through choices of gifts. Blackening the sky reminds us that the gardens of pleasure are not without what you call a break in ideal conditions when we're talking about what occurs in this life. Blessed sun. Well, sometimes we see the moon and the sun in the sky at the same time, but the night when the moon is out, it is the time when it seems like the moon reigns and the sun constantly, even when the moon's in the sky, seems as if it is in charge. Lion gentle reminds us that just like the hunters of nature are not always on the hunt or out to hurt, such is the case with woman. The woman doesn't have to hurt, and you'd say the same thing with a man, right? Is that a man doesn't have to hurt other human beings? The palm tree and other such things that are not of the area where you were from or remain will have certain associations. Those that are will again have certain associations, like, sitting under it and whatever you did sitting under it. And what the resources of the tree, what do they do? Spite of mirrors reminds us that there's perceptions that others will have, things that others will notice, that even if you spend a lot of time with your reflection, you're still going to miss some of those things. Now, I practice scrying, and not really scheduled, but sometimes I do look in a regular mirror, and it's not as easy to have some of the experiences as a darkened mirror, but you do have some experiences, and it seems like there's differences with each, right? Like there's slight differences with some stones and stuff, but as far as mirrors and colors and brightness and stuff like this, you find a lot more difference with the actual color and brightness of the reflective object and the amount of reflectivity of how well the reflection is. Pride of love reminds us to feel what we're going to feel, and that pride, of course, can really tarnish the relationship for the other person and eventually oneself, right? Hooded flame. Well, that just reminds me of the astrological mention in it that when people let these conceptions of the astrological references get to them, it can sour what would otherwise be sweet or enjoyable or whatever. I've never had wine, so. Injuries. Well, sometimes when people hurt others, they hurt themselves. Her brief withdrawal reminds us that we can involve others in our dreams, as they say. Our hopes and our plans can be made around certain individuals, or they can't. The crane is, again, one of those things of referring to what's going on outside of you in a way of referring to what's going on inside of you. And people often wonder, what do these animals want? And, there's all sorts of posts about, my cat's doing this, or this is, why does this dog do this? And, what does that thing want? And, there's a lot less when it comes to wild animals, but, you can look at some of their behaviors and figure it out, or someone else figured it out. Strangeness reminds us of how others relating to us is not the same way that we relate to them, even when there's some sort of overall mutualness. Hide and seek reminds us that the imagination of children sometimes gets the best of them. But then again, children sometimes do perceive things that the adults are not perceiving. The hero reminds us of what some people will put us through to test us, or what we've gone through and how we can use that to prove things to people in a way. At 72 is an appreciation of still having ability. Now, a lot of people exaggerate quite a bit, or they look at statistics. But what matters is, I'm this age and I still have this ability. How can I care? Is how, what's really cared about is the personal relationship, not the luxuries or extras that people have, or certainly the other has. Though once true lovers reminds us of basically praying for the other and how things went wrong, and admitting one's own faults and how things went wrong. Cherries or lilies reminds us of the sort of alleged opposite games that people play, like love and power, not mentioned here in that way, but you have that as one that people bring up. Death and love, again, something that people could say are as opposites. But we can have the beauty and the sweetness and both love and death. Crown of stars brings things through the ages. Now, when people talk about their mythical goddesses, they talk about the virgin, the wife, and the elderly as their triple reference. at least in terms of life lessons, right? There, you know, plenty of three sisters and they each have a different thing, or nine sisters and they're each a different type of muse. Fig tree in leaf reminds me of some of the things that people try to play interpretation wise to that odd referenced parable in the Bible. Now, things being of certain seasons and all that, and different things about plants that people may not realize, like the cashew is one of those big ones because, you know, people get the nut, but what about the fruit? And what about the rest of the tree? Is there anything you can do with the rest of the tree? This is sort of the reference here, but of course it's bounced off the reference of a woman. A dewdrop. Dewdrop and Diamond is the name of the song, and fig leaf and fig tree in leaf. So the diamond, you know, it's more specific. The dewdrop has more of a universal life to it. And another song, Just Friends, reminds us that that sort of thing doesn't have to be any, you know, different, right? People like to categorize things, but the best spouses often end up being, you know, the best friends. Or they branch off of that. Nowadays, there's a lot of pretending when it comes to men and women. It's like, well, if the circumstances were different, you wouldn't be just friends. Of course, reminds us that some things are secret. Sometimes the secret is in the doing or in the specific context of it. 3 rings for her reminds of how, you know, different symbolism can be attached to things and grouped together. Sincerement. Oh, I don't know what this is. I mean, you know, it's in French. An instant of confusion. A description that's sincere and a succinct point. Dans un silhouette. Something about the femininity of it. And yeah, I'm pretty much lost about trying to translate that. So commenting on it is, you know, not really going anywhere for us, is it? Is now the time? Reminds us that, you know, we should do what we do. And honestly, if we're like, is it time to leave yet? No, it's not. Okay, well, you know, then you end up late. Twins can be a reference to how we have multiple sides of our character, but it's often the reference of how they specifically try to be different, much more than other siblings. Sail and oar reminds that people do the same work overall, but together they each do their part, and those parts can be different. Gooseflesh Abbey reminds us that people can, take on a life that outwardly seems like they're of a different spiritual side. And oddities of how they live, like, in their monk or priest or nun or whatever room, well, what is it? What is it? Is it specifically a violation, or is it not? Or the homecoming reminds us that people change, and sometimes it's, to a degree, unrecognizable, even if it's of a short time. Like, their appearance didn't change too much, but something's different about them. With the gift of a lion's claw, definitely seems how with the zodiac you have Cancer, and then you have Leo. And it bounces off this idea that Cancer is as the retreat. Now, if you have Cancer listed as the August sign, well, it becomes more noticeable. Night gets a foothold, right? And so the backwards thing, well, sort of reversing this thing. Wigs and beards. Oh, it's political. I didn't remember whether it was some sort of communication between wigs and beards, because wasn't there like a comic book, like one of like those one frame comics there was a bunch of jokes about the food that gets stuck in beards and mustaches and that sort of thing. Who was that by? But it's a reminder of the whole political thing. And when it comes to politics, people think they're of such a different sides, and that's become less and less of a thing. And really, the different sides have more to do with the sort of ancestry that people have, not what actually gets done. Personal Packaging Incorporated reminds us of how some of the modern ways of transporting and categorizing and preserving might be metaphors of what's going on with society, or what could go on with society. Workroom reminds us that there's sort of a layout and things there for the work. But with work, well, there's always that return of more work to do, because it's been, presented to you that there's more work to do. The Ark reminds that when it comes to who divinity has set it to be saved, well, they're going to be saved. All except Hannibal. Reminds us that the leaders have to stand alone in some way. And they are really the ones that they need to make sure that everybody else gets their rest and their payment and stuff like this. It's not they stand alone and, like with some of these modern companies, and leave with the bag. The Beggar Maid and King Cophetua. The Beggar Maid and King Cophetua reminds us that some signs may give individuals away, particularly when they seek to betray. But the boldness of it still can have an impact on others. Forever reminds us that judgment can sidestep the little claims of circumstances. Jugium improbum reminds us that we are propelled towards some ends. De art poetica reminds us that sometimes we need to use a sort of minimalism. Sit mihi terra levis. We can try to avoid the inevitable, but when it's over, we need to realize our, mistake. Estimelosa might be a reference to some sort of entity that's not human. Definitely seems like it. And certainly those sort of entities are going to be what they are, regardless of what the humans are. And they don't have to answer us. People think you can just perform the right ritual and everything will appear and do your bidding or talk to you or whatever. That's not true. Tossal pillow is one of the things that a lot of people like to play nowadays, is the god and goddess sort of thing. And this one is about returning to an idea of things being fresh. So perhaps treating whatever aspect of the relationship like it's not something that was gone through before. To be in love makes us think of the outsider's view. The view before, the view after, fact of the act makes us think of innocence, of consideration of possibilities, of beyond blame, beyond shame, are a fall to Ogmian Hercules. Kind of puts him in a Odin-like context, right? Arrow shots reminds us that there are unmistakable signals, but the way things are nowadays and how people try to gaslight people, that's not quite so anymore. She to him is like some of those smug things that people say, right? Within reason reminds us that even what we want may come in a shocking way. And there are limits of what one is to put up with. Yet unsayable. Reminds of those moments where it was, not necessary to say anything. And how things seem to just None the wiser refers to how people may use the term metaphysical as a criticism, whether they're just referring to the section after physics in Aristotle's work, or whether they're referring to something, spiritual, maybe of mental construction. It's like, well, those things are their own reality. So if there's something implied, there's nothing wrong with something being implied. It depends on what, right? The narrow sea reminds us that we can be ready for such things as death. The olive yard, well, olives are a symbol of what takes a while to come to fruition. And the books of the work can be laid open, and we can take account of ourselves before we're forced through an account, right? To a rose is probably bounced off the biblical references, Song of Solomon, right? Reminds us of how youthly beauty and such can provide something that carries on. Green morning, well, in this building I have had what you would call a green morning. I intended to retreat here the night that this tree crashed through, and there's bits of cement and metal and nails and the other room and whatnot. But I got the sense during the scrying of the evening before that this place hasn't leaked, but there's going to be rain, and there's going to be need for a roof repair or something like that. And then this happened. And it also reminds me of how some of the dreams and stuff that I have, well, they seem to come in layers. Like a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there, and then finally you get the whole thing. And sometimes the pieces that you remember before aren't the whole picture, Beyond giving makes us think of what is held back. Trial of innocence. Well, people need to stop it with this made a man or made a woman sort of stuff. Nature does that regardless of our situations. And innocence doesn't have to be lost by exposure. Like, for example, nobody takes anybody's innocence. People can choose to give away their innocence, as you could call it. Poison day. Sounds like falling asleep outside, right? Or being read out on a journey and, again, falling asleep outside. Probably more of a danger, probably a lot more dangerous than it was at that time. Certainly the wolves and stuff had been pretty much driven out of society. People had their dogs under control and, stuff like that. But I could be thinking back to, how they got sick. Superstition. Well, we shouldn't go around just needlessly cursing people, especially when, we were about the same thing when we were in such and such a relationship and that sort of stuff. the people who are in that situation, trying to cast spells on each other afterwards to bring things back and whatnot, and and the replacement and that sort of stuff in the name of virtue. Well, reminds of what a person holds back on. Well, there are dangers to college and stuff like that are, not that, but, and you can be educated without, necessarily having to agree with the value system of those that, you go to school with. But a lot of people use things like that as an excuse not to engage in life. What we did next includes some symbols of incipience, of detail, of meaning and production. And then, you still don't remember everything, right? Compact reminds us not to make the mistake, well, not directly, but not to make the mistake that some people do. It's like, okay, one person is trying for virtue, the other person is trying to tempt them. It's like, no, don't engage in that. You want multiple people that are towards the same thing. Like with romantic relationships, you do want soulmates. You don't just want people that are trying to convince each other that they can put up with each other long enough for certain behaviors and maybe, make those more safe by keeping those within the relationship. New Year's kisses, well, that reminds of the sort of rituals that people play with the holy kiss and all that. It's not a play and all that, but those ideas of Wicca and stuff don't start with Wicca. And of course, they can be reserved for spouses. A lot of people think that Tantra and stuff like this can't be done with one spouse, and it's like, it most definitely can be reserved for such a situation. The clocks of time remind us of the problem of a lack of synchronicity between the ways of multiple people. It also reminds us of how in the modern age people will approach time differently than they ever did before. Instead of, evening prayers, night prayers, go to sleep, if you're going to eat in between and all that other stuff, and then just going to bed. Now, more than ever, you got TV and all that stuff, and so people stay up for the TV, and some people think, oh, that's not worth it. And then you end up with whole conflicts about scheduling. And even the lights, even without that, you got reliable and cheap lighting. Well, gold cloud draws the scene from the sky to the earth to reconnecting with those you knew in the afterlife. Basket of blossom. Reminds us that our honor relates to what we group in to our promises. Wherever we may be, could be a thought about how if people are separate, they can still draw things in. Like, for example, with this building, I've said about 333 that time I try to be in spiritual practice, explicitly in spiritual practice, if not saying a particular chant or reading a particular scripture or whatever. I try that. And so, in that sense, people can be united, but that's in a different way here. And here is like, okay, all of these are qualities we could be taking part in, but we're united in taking part at this time. What is love? Kind of comes off as the whole, song. Baby, don't hurt me, That's not the tone. Kind of makes you wonder what's going to be after death. Is it unto death, or does it go on? That love. The promise reminds us that regardless of any activity, our relation, we still need our rest. Yesterday only uses the images of the seasons, and it reminds us that regardless which one it was, the past is the past, semi-detached. Well, in a way, you want to be ultimately detached, but you're only semi-detached. Like I keep on talking about the material. For the material, you don't want that, so you want to be detached for that. But then again, the material is a means, so the idea of using the material as the means, that comes out a lot different. Now, we won't always be going through the same thing as other people, but so we need to learn to be different, but then again, we need to learn to care at the same time. Iago, well, people can say it refers to witchcraft, but then again, it refers to manipulation that can have dire consequences. Against witchcraft warns against seduction, doesn't it? Troublesome fame reminds us that acquiring renown can bounce back on us, right? Now, it doesn't stay on the reference to Alexander, but certainly some of these figures have fallen in time. Toiling Bell reminds us that, seeing what happens after death can kind of be disturbing. Honestly, we should bury soon after death, just because you have chemicals and all that nowadays doesn't mean, and the way that kind of rots sometimes is just, I've been to graveyards and the dripping out of things, and that you occasionally see that. So the chemicals to preserve, but then again, seeing what happens with the tomb and all that sort of stuff can kind of remind us of the temporary sense of whatever we have in life here. Blanket charge reminds us that we really should know what's going on about either right or wrong, or what society is going to do something about, or could. The straight message? Well, we need to get to the point, and the point of enacting with people that are known shouldn't be this big old focus on, fan. You don't want to be a fan of anybody. Certainly get some knowledge from them or figure some way toward mutual benefit of some sort, but not, the Sundial's Lament kind of seems like a January sort of poem, right? And it gets into biblical themes. Of course, the winter people kind of don't go out as much, so they think more about, some big thing that they're held back from, and that kind of leads to other big things. A reminder is one of those odd shaped poems, diagonal lines with letter here and, that sort of thing. And trying to turn it into something that it isn't, and it kind of comes off as something different in structure when you do that. Antorka y Corona is translated, and that translation is called Torch and Crown, and it reminds us of how there were differences in insignias and that sort of stuff between men and women, and how some things were just, reserved for women. Like in Islamic society, they still reserve wearing gold and silk more than a tie, or if you have a medical skin condition or something, you can wear more as a male, I guess. But so there's certain things that are reserved for women. Now, some cultures, when you have a bunch of people from different countries, you really can't wear any color. Well, if you don't consider black and white colors, they'll say, well, okay. And then they'll go like men can wear white, or men can wear black, but they can't wear the other. And so pretty much any color or lack of color, or all the colors that you can wear, some culture says, oh, that's not for men. And other cultures will say that is for men, so that can kind of get confusing. But, it's important to know of some of that stuff. Armistice Day, well, certainly this war to end all war sort of stuff, we find out that when World War I was going on, they were planning World War III. So, yeah. And somehow, without some of the weapons that were developed in World War II, they were planning to kill off most of the people on Earth through these wars. So, but they always put forward that hope. It's like, oh, if we could just get past this, there won't be any more wars, or at least this will be the biggest war. And it's like, no, I think people push further along the excuse. The moats. Well, little difficulties thrown in can pile up to big difficulties. And some of that, of course, is the, blaming others. If and when, very difficult games to play sometimes is the whole if and when thing. And if something really affects someone, or if they're affected by those unknowns, then, and they keep them to themselves, it can create even more issues between things. But then again, some people feel like they don't have to say certain things. There's been certain people that I have talked to that it got to the point where there'd be gaps as far as what other people would need. And it's like they're talking in a different language. It's like, no, not quite. It's just knowing well enough to fill in the sentences and not say them. Ellipses.